He didn't plan on being anyone's father. The doctor in Denver had called it a closed door, a lock without a key. And the woman who once promised him forever, well, she walked right through that door and never looked back. So when Emery Voss, a quiet mountain man with more ghosts than neighbors, handed over 3 worn silver dollars for 3 half-starved children no one else wanted, he didn't expect them to call him anything at all, least of all Papa. But that's the thing about the high lonesome places. Life doesn't ask permission. It just shows up, hungry and shivering, and dares you to turn it away. Folks in town, the few who even noticed him, would have said he bought trouble. They'd say no man could raise 3 orphan girls alone on a mountain that had already swallowed his wife and his future. Especially not a man like Emery, a man with a past full of ashes and a heart that had long forgotten how to stretch. But the oldest girl, Junie, she had eyes that held the hard glint of truth. May, the quiet one, hummed to the chickens like they were the only ones who understood her language. And little Bess, she clung to his worn flannel shirt like it was the only solid thing left in the whole spinning world. They didn't care about the law. They didn't care about blood. They didn't care that the cabin had one big bed and a floor, not 3 neat rooms. They only cared that the old iron stove stayed warm through the night. They only cared that the nightmares seemed to pause when he read from a battered old book, his voice a low rumble against the howl of the wind. They only cared that when they cried, for the first time in their short, hard lives, someone finally listened. So what happens when the law finally decides to climb that mountain, carrying papers and threats and a cold that no fire can melt? What happens when a quiet, unearned love is put on trial by a world that doesn't understand it? And what kind of man do you become when 3 little voices, passed from hand to hand like kindling, finally look up at you and say, "You're the only one who never let go"? This isn't just a story about a man and 3 girls. It's about being chosen long after you've given up on ever being picked. It's about finding a family in the rubble of a life and letting it teach you how to hope again. So come on in closer. Settle in and listen, because what happens next up on that ridge will break your heart, and then it will piece it back together, stronger than before. You're going to want to hear the rest of this. The town of Clifftop barely registered his existence. Emery Voss was a shadow, a mountain man by habit and heart, with shoulders like stacked lumber and a voice roughened by more winters than words. People mistook his silence for simplicity, but that wasn't it. Emery just didn't waste things. Not food, not time, and certainly not feelings. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was the secret garden behind his cabin. He'd planted it years ago, 3 rose bushes in a perfect line, one for each name they never got to say aloud. Back then, a man's failure to produce an heir wasn't called infertility. It was a curse, a failing whispered about in church halls, blamed on bad luck or the will of God. His wife, Lenora, had cried herself silent in the dark of the pantry, where the mountain light couldn't find her. She left in the spring, said she couldn't stand the sound of the wind in a house that echoed like an empty cradle. That was 5 winters ago. Since then, Emery's only conversations were with the wind itself. He kept 3 small plates on a high shelf, gathering dust. He patched 3 tiny pairs of mittens every autumn, their wool never touched by small hands. He built a single swing that swayed in the breeze, a lonely pendulum marking time. Then came that gray October morning. He'd come to town for nails and lamp oil, his wagon wheels groaning a familiar complaint, and there they were, lined up like damaged goods outside the old freight depot. 3 little girls with matted hair, dull eyes, and shoes that didn't even match each other, let alone a pair. A man in a sweat-stained vest smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation barked at the few who passed by. $3 for the lot. Take 'em off my hands. Sisters, cousins, who knows? Who cares? Emery stopped. Not because he needed children. Lord knows the world had told him in no uncertain terms that he couldn't have them. He stopped because the youngest one, the little one, looked up at him with the exact same expression the wind had when it crept under his cabin door at night. Not pleading, not desperate, just waiting. He didn't say a word. He reached into his worn leather pouch and pulled out $3 silver, the ones he kept for luck. He dropped them into the man's grimy hand, the coins clinking with a sound of grim finality. It felt no different than buying nails. He led them to his wagon, didn't ask their names, didn't offer his. As they climbed onto the rough-sawn planks, the oldest girl, no more than 10, reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched his elbow. Her touch was as light as a moth's wing. Do we call you something?" she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. He blinked, the question catching him off guard. Before he could answer, the other two joined in, their voices soft as new snow, like they were trying on a word for the first time, a word they weren't sure they were allowed to use. "Papa!" Emery Voss had faced down blizzards that could strip bark from trees. He'd stared into the yellow eyes of coyotes in the dead of night. He lived with the deafening silence of empty cribs. But that one word, that single, whispered word, it hit him like a bullet. It shattered the thick ice of silence he'd wrapped around his life for 5 long years. Back at the cabin, he ladled 4 bowls of thick rabbit stew. It was the first time in half a decade that more than one plate on his table was filled. He watched them, silent, as 3 small spoons scraped the bottom of the bowls with a desperate ferocity, like they'd never known a meal was meant to last, that another might be coming. Sometimes it's not what you're missing that finally breaks you. It's seeing what you never, ever thought you could have sitting right across the table from you, calling you by a name you thought you'd never hear. Emery's cabin had never felt too big, just empty, but now filled with 3 small shifting shadows. It seemed to shrink, the walls pulling in close. They hadn't brought much with them, just a stained burlap sack containing 1 cracked comb, a Bible with its cover torn off, and a single pair of mismatched boots that were too small for any of them. That first night, they didn't ask for beds. They curled up together on the old bearskin rug by the fire, their small bodies fitting together like puzzle pieces, a tangle of limbs and quiet breathing. They didn't cry. They didn't even whimper. They just slept, their exhaustion a tangible weight in the room. And for the first time in 5 years, the cabin didn't echo. Morning came with a skiff of snow, the kind that melts before it has a chance to matter. The eldest girl, the one who was too tall and too still for a 10-year-old, was already at the hearth. She was stoking the embers back to life with a practiced hand, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. She didn't wait for him to ask. She just knew a fire was a thing that had to be kept alive. "Her name's Junie," she said, nodding her head toward the youngest, still asleep. "That one's Bess. And I'm May." Her voice was flat, a statement of fact, not an introduction. Emery just nodded, pouring hot water over a bowl of oats. He didn't ask if those were the names they were born with. He could see it in their eyes. These were names they had chosen for themselves, not names given by men in vests holding ledgers. These were names carved out of stubborn, desperate hope. That day he found a scrap of bright yellow ribbon frozen to the porch rail, a ghost of some forgotten celebration. Without thinking, he tied it to the handle of his wood-splitting axe, just to see a flash of color against the gray world. By the 3rd day, a change had started. Bess was humming, a tuneless, repetitive sound that was somehow more comforting than silence. May had arranged a neat line of pine cones by the door, ordered perfectly by size. And Junie, the watchful one, she approached him while he was checking the ropes on the old swing. "Is it safe?" she asked. It was the first question any of them had asked him directly, the first time anyone had asked him about something he had made. He didn't answer with words. He answered by spending the next hour tightening the ropes, sanding the wooden seat until it was smooth as glass, and giving it a hard push, sending it soaring into the crisp mountain air. That evening, he broke out a small tin of blackberry jam he'd been saving for a Christmas that was never going to come. He watched as 3 spoons scraped the jar clean, their movements a little less frantic than before. But kindness, he knew, doesn't just erase the past. It's never that easy. That night, the ghost came calling. May flinched violently at the low hoot of an owl. Bess sat bolt upright in her sleep, breathing hard from a nightmare she couldn't name. And little Junie? She wet the blankets, then, consumed by shame, she tried to hide the evidence deep in the woodpile. Emery didn't yell. He didn't shame her. He simply retrieved the wet blanket, washed it in the basin, and set it to dry by the fire. He climbed the ladder to the small loft, a space filled with dusty memories, and made her a fresh bed of old quilts. He tucked her in, his rough hands clumsy and strange. By the end of the week, they no longer whispered "Papa" like a question. They said it like a habit, a promise, a word taking root in the rocky soil of their new life. Sometimes family doesn't come from blood. It comes from someone leaving the door unlocked and not asking why you came stumbling in out of the dark. But Emery Voss had lived alone long enough to know that an unlocked door can let things in, and it can also let things out. He wasn't afraid of silence anymore. Now he was afraid of the sound of footsteps. Word travels fast in timber towns, carried on the wind like smoke. At Lark's Hollow trading post while buying flour and salt, he heard the whispers. Heard Voss took in 3 strays. Ain't right. A man alone. No wife. Where'd they even come from? Where's their people? He tried to ignore it, his face a mask of stone. But then a man from the courthouse, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and watery eyes, cornered him by the pickle barrel. You got papers for those girls, Voss? Emery just stared at him. Papers. As if what they had could be contained on a piece of paper. As if you could document the way Bess helped him mend a quilt with her clumsy, earnest stitches. As if you could notarize the trust in May's eyes as she climbed higher and higher on the swing. As if you could file away the muddy handprint Junie had left on the windowsill, a mark he couldn't bring himself to wipe away. One evening the cold came down from the peaks with a vengeance. May stood outside too long, just staring at the dark tree line, not answering when her sisters called. When Emery finally went out to get her, he found her barefoot in the freezing mud. He used to whistle from there, she whispered, her voice barely audible, her body trembling. Who, May? Who used to whistle? Her lip quivered. The man, the one who sold us. A tear froze on her cheek. I thought maybe he'd come back for us. Emery didn't ask why she sounded terrified, not hopeful. He didn't ask what the man had done to make her fear his return. He just lifted her into his arms, his old knees groaning in protest, and carried her back into the warmth and light of the cabin. That night, long after the girls were asleep in the loft, Emery sat by the dying fire. He held a cold bar of lye soap in his hands, turning it over and over, as if it held some profound truth. Could he keep them safe? Was this small cabin, this little circle of light, enough to hold back the darkness of the world? He thought of the nursery he'd built, the rose bushes now barren and thorny, and felt a familiar, hollow ache. And then the knock came. It wasn't a loud knock, not the sharp rap of the law or the heavy thud of a neighbor. It was a soft, steady, persistent tapping, a sound that had traveled a long, long way. He opened the door to a woman. She stood there in travel-worn shoes and a cloak too thin for the biting October wind. Her face was pale, etched with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with a fierce, desperate light. I'm looking for 3 girls, she said, her voice cracking with cold and fatigue. I heard a man on this mountain took them in. Please, just tell me, are they alive? Some ghosts come wearing a badge and carrying the law. Others come wearing grief. And sometimes the hardest storm you'll ever face is the one that stands on your doorstep and asks, with a quiet, devastating certainty, are you sure they're yours to keep? The woman's name was Alma Greer. She spoke like someone who had used up all her words and was now running on fumes. When Emery Voss opened the cabin door wider, he didn't ask for papers or proof. He just said, it's warm inside. She collapsed into a chair near the stove, shivering not from the cold outside, but from something deep within. She held her hands out to the warmth as if she might crumble into dust if the fire went out. The girls came down the ladder from the loft, one by one. Junie first, then Bess, then May. They didn't run to Alma. They didn't cry out her name. They just stood there, a few feet away, looking at her with a long, searching gaze. It was the look of someone who recognizes a face from a dream, but can't quite remember what it used to mean. I was with them, Alma said, her voice a raw whisper. Back when we were all still in Texas, before the raids, before Silas. The name hung in the air like poison. He sold us like cattle, she continued, her voice cracking. I tried to find them. I swear I did. But the records, no one writes down the names of girls without fathers. No one keeps track of the ones who fall through the cracks. Emery made tea, the familiar ritual a comfort in the sudden chaos. He poured a cup and handed it to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He let her speak in her own time, letting the story spill out. Alma, it turned out, was not their mother. She had been their protector. A teenage girl herself back then, barely more than a child, she had been tasked with keeping these three little ones alive after their parents vanished in the chaos. Then one morning, she'd woken up to find the wagon gone. The man who had promised them all work and safety, Silas, had taken the girls and left her in the middle of the desert with nothing but a half-empty water jug and a lie. "I've been looking ever since," she said, her eyes finding Emery's across the small room. "For months. I walked halfway across the country. I didn't even know if they were still—" Her voice trailed off into a choked sob. It was Bess who moved first. She walked slowly to Alma and laid her head in the woman's lap. Then May touched her hand, a tentative, questioning gesture. Junie, the oldest and most guarded, finally whispered, "We called him Papa now, but we remember you." Later that evening, after the girls had shown Alma their beds in the loft, after a fragile peace had settled over the cabin, Alma turned to Emery. "I can leave in the morning. I don't want to cause you any trouble." Emery looked her square in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "There's room," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You don't have to go." That night, the cabin didn't just feel full. It felt right. 5 bowls on the table instead of 4. The low murmur of conversation weaving through the crackle of the fire. A kind of hesitant laughter that rose and fell, like the wind through the tall pines. Outside, the thorny rose bushes were brittle with the coming frost. But as Emery banked the fire for the night, he glanced out the window and thought he saw a tiny speck of green, a new shoot, pushing its way up through the frozen ground. Sometimes healing doesn't come from starting over from scratch. It comes from finding the pieces you lost along the way and finally putting them back together again. But Emery knew better than to trust a fragile new beginning. The man's name was Silas. And a man like that doesn't just give up what he considers his property. He hadn't just sold the girls, he had set them as bait. And Emery had walked right into the trap. The real storm was still coming. He could feel it in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. A new kind of quiet had settled over the cabin. Not the peaceful quiet of before, but a watchful, waiting silence. Alma was a godsend, her presence a soft buffer between his own rough edges and the girls' fragility. She taught them songs he'd never heard, braided their hair with a gentle expertise he could never master. But at night, after the girls were asleep, he and Alma would sit by the fire, the unspoken questions hanging heavy between them. "He's not just a trafficker, is he?" Emery said one night, his voice low. "Silas." Alma stared into the flames, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "No," she said. "He's a collector. He believes some people, special people, belong to him. He thinks he can see the light in them, and once he sees it, he never lets go." She shuddered. Their parents, the girls' parents, they had that light, and so do they. Emery felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This was deeper and darker than he had imagined. "And he just let you go?" Alma finally looked at him, and for the first time he saw not just exhaustion in her eyes, but a flicker of something else, something hard and cunning. "He didn't let me go, Emery. I got away. And I stole something of his when I left." She paused. "A ledger, with names, dates, transactions, proof of everything he's done." So that's why she was here. It wasn't just about finding the girls. It was about finishing a fight. The very next day, the sheriff from Clifftop rode up the mountain path. Not the clerk this time, but Sheriff Brody himself, a man whose face looked like a road map of every hard winter he'd ever survived. "Voss," he said, not bothering to dismount, "got a visitor for you. Says he's got a legal claim." Behind him, on a sleek black horse with shoes too new for mountain travel, sat a man in a fine city coat and polished leather gloves. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he looked perfectly able-bodied. His smile was thin and cold, like a crack in ice. Emery Voss, the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. My name is Lyle Thresher. I represent an estate that has a prior and legally binding guardianship claim to these three children. The girls, who had been playing by the woodpile, froze. Alma stepped out onto the porch, her body instinctively shielding the doorway. You have no claim here, Alma said, her voice tight. Thresher's smile widened. On the contrary, Ms. Greer, we have every claim. You see, their parents, before their untimely passing, incurred a significant debt, a debt that was transferred in writing to my client in the form of an indenture. These girls are not orphans. They are collateral. The word hung in the freezing air, ugly and obscene. That's a lie, Alma spat. Is it? Thresher slid a folded document from his coat pocket and handed it to the sheriff. It's all there in the indenture papers, signed and witnessed. Mr. Voss here engaged in an illegal transaction. Technically, that's trafficking. He looked directly at Emery, his eyes gleaming with malice. The law is a funny thing, Mountain Man. It doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about the ink on the page. That night, the cabin felt like a tomb. The legal paper sat on the table, a white snake in the lantern light. They were trapped. To fight this in court would be to admit how Emery had gotten them. To run would be to prove Thresher's accusation. Junie, her face pale, climbed into Emery's lap. It was an awkward, unpracticed gesture, but her small weight was an anchor in the swirling chaos. He's one of them, isn't he? She whispered. A man like Silas. Emery wrapped his arms around her. Yes, he said, his voice thick. But you're not going with him. Alma slammed her tea mug down on the table. No, we're not. She looked at Emery, her eyes burning with a new fire. He mentioned my ledger. Silas must have sent Thresher here to get it back. This isn't about the girls anymore. It's about burying his crimes. She took a deep breath. If it's a fight they want, we won't send you in alone, Emery. And in the silence that followed her words, Emery realized something profound. For most of his life, he had been the one left behind. By his parents, by his dreams, by Lenora. But now, in the face of the coming storm, someone was choosing to stay. Sometimes the law doesn't know the difference between being owned and being loved. And sometimes, to protect your family, you have to be willing to break it. The next move came faster than they expected. It wasn't a court summons. It was a single sheet of paper, nailed to their front door in the dead of night. It was a notice of foreclosure, not on the cabin, but on the land itself. According to the document, signed by a circuit judge in a town 2 counties over, Emery Voss was in default on a decades-old loan taken out by his father, a loan Emery had never even known existed. The property and everything on it was to be auctioned off in 10 days. The new owner of the debt? A holding company represented by Lyle Thresher. It was a brilliant, cruel move. They weren't just coming for the girls anymore. They were coming for everything. The land, the cabin, the very ground beneath their feet. They were trying to smoke them out, to leave them with nothing, so that when Thresher returned, he could rescue the children from a homeless, destitute criminal. He's boxing us in, Emery said, his hand crumpling the notice. If we leave, we lose the land. If we stay, he'll bring the law down on us for trespassing. Alma paced the small cabin like a caged wolf. There has to be a way. The ledger, if I can get it to the right people, to a U.S. Marshal, not some local judge on Silas's payroll. How? Emery asked, the single word heavy with despair. The nearest federal office is in Denver. That's a week's ride, maybe more in this weather. And you can bet Thresher has men watching the roads. They'd never let you get through. A heavy silence fell. The fire crackled, oblivious to the tightening noose around them. Bess started to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs that tore at Emery's heart. Then May, the quiet one, the one who saw things others missed, spoke up. The river, she said, her voice small but clear. They both looked at her. The old trapper's route, she continued, pointing toward the window that faced the steep ravine behind the cabin. When the water's low, there are caves, tunnels. They go all the way through the mountain. Emery stared at her. He knew of the caves, of course. They were dangerous, unstable, a maze that had claimed more than one life over the years. No one had used them since his grandfather's time. "How do you know about that?" he asked. May looked down at her feet. "The man, Silas, he used them sometimes. To move things. People. He thought we were sleeping." It was a terrifying risk, but it was the only one they had. A plan began to form, desperate and wild. Alma, guided by May's memory, would take the caves. Emery would stay, along with Junie and Bess, to create a diversion, to make it look like they were all still there, hunkering down for a fight. "No," Junie said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm going with her." She looked at Alma. "I know the signs he uses, the marks he leaves on the rocks. I can help you." Emery wanted to protest, to lock them all inside and stand guard with his rifle until the end of time. But he saw the look in Junie's eyes. This wasn't just about escape. This was about defiance. It was about taking back the power that had been stolen from them. That night, under the sliver of a cold moon, Emery watched Alma and Junie slip out the back of the cabin and disappear into the darkness of the ravine. He held Bess and May close, the weight of their small bodies both a comfort and a terrifying responsibility. He was sending a woman he barely knew, and a child he'd come to love as his own into the belly of the mountain, armed with nothing but a ledger and a prayer. For the first time in his life, Emery Voss wasn't just fighting his own ghosts. He was fighting a real, living monster, and he had just sent him the two people he wanted most. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Emery kept the smoke curling from the chimney, moved the lamps around at night to make it seem like the cabin was full. He and the two younger girls became ghosts in their own home, speaking in whispers, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind. He taught Bess how to load his old rifle, his hands shaking as he guided hers. He saw the grim determination in May's eyes as she practiced sighting down the barrel. They were no longer children playing. They were soldiers. On the fifth day, a lone rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't Thresher. It wasn't the sheriff. It was the man from the freight depot, the one in the sweat-stained vest who had sold them for $3 silver. He didn't approach the cabin. He just sat on his horse, watching. Emery stood in the doorway, his rifle held loosely at his side, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The man just stared, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. Then he raised a hand to his mouth and let out a long, low whistle. The same whistle May had described. A cold terror washed over Emery. It wasn't Silas. This was just one of his foot soldiers. A scout. They knew. They must have known Alma and Junie were gone. The caves had been a trap. The man wheeled his horse around and galloped back into the trees. He had seen what he needed to see. Emery was alone with the two youngest. They were vulnerable. Panic threatened to swallow him whole. He had to get the girls out. But where? The main path was watched. The caves were a death trap. They were surrounded. He looked at Bess and May, their small faces pale with fear, and a wave of pure, primal rage washed over him. He had failed. He had brought them here, promised them safety, and he had led them straight into the monster's jaws. He barred the door, jammed a chair under the handle, and pushed the heavy wooden table against it. He dragged old chests and sacks of flour to barricade the windows. The cabin became a fortress, a tomb. As darkness fell, the whistling started again. This time, it wasn't just one man. It was coming from all sides, a chorus of predators circling their prey. They weren't coming in. Not yet. They were playing with him. They were letting the fear do their work for them. May tugged on his sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, her eyes wide. "The floor." He looked down. In his frantic barricading, he'd moved the old bearskin rug, and beneath it, nearly invisible against the dark wood, was the faint outline of a trap door. He'd lived in this cabin his entire life and had never known it was there. It was old, covered by years of dust and grime. "My grandpa," Emery breathed, a memory surfacing from the deep past. He was a moonshiner during the Prohibition, a root seller. With trembling hands, he pried at the edges. It was stuck fast. He grabbed a crowbar from the hearth and heaved. The wood groaned, then splintered, and the door lifted. A wave of cool, earthy air washed over them. Below was a dark square hole and a rickety ladder descending into blackness. It wasn't a way out, but it was a place to hide. "Get in," he whispered to the girls, his voice urgent. "Go to the back and stay quiet. No matter what you hear. Do you understand? No matter what." They scurried down the ladder without a word. He was about to follow when he stopped. He couldn't just hide. That wasn't who he was. That wasn't the man they called Papa. He looked at his rifle, then at the heavy iron poker by the fire. Hiding wouldn't save Alma and Junie. He had to make a stand. He gently closed the trap door, slid the heavy rug back over it, and turned to face the door of the cabin. The whistling had stopped. Now there was a new sound, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the frozen ground, getting closer and closer. Then a voice, smooth and chillingly familiar, cut through the night. It wasn't Thresher. "Emery," the voice called out, dripping with false camaraderie. "It's been a long time. You've been a hard man to find, but I always find what's mine." It was Silas, and he was right outside the door. The knock that came next wasn't soft like Alma's had been. It was the heavy, authoritative thud of a man who believed the whole world belonged to him. Emery's knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. His mind raced. There was only one of him. How many were out there? 2, 5, 10? It didn't matter. He had to buy time. Time for Alma and Junie. Time for a miracle. "I don't want any trouble, Silas," Emery called out, his voice rougher than he intended. A low chuckle answered him. "Oh, but you already have trouble, Emery. You have my property, 3 lovely little birds who flew their coop, and I've come to collect them." Another voice joined his, the oily tone of Lyle Thresher. "The choice is simple, Voss. Open the door and hand over the children, and we'll let you live out your miserable days on this rock. Resist and we'll burn this cabin to the ground with you inside it. The law will call it a tragic accident." The law. They were using it as both a shield and a sword. Emery glanced at the trap door, praying the girls were staying quiet. He had to split them up. Create chaos. "The girls aren't here," he yelled, stalling. "Sent them away." "Don't lie to me, Emery." Silas's voice was sharp, cutting. "My man saw you. Just you and the little ones. Now I'm losing my patience. You have 10 seconds. Emery backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the small room. The fireplace. The chimney was wide, built of old river stone. It was a climb, but it was possible. It was a crazy, desperate idea, but it was the only one he had. 9. He propped his rifle against the wall, pointing at the door. He tied a piece of twine from the trigger to the leg of the heavy table. A crude booby trap. It wouldn't stop them, but it might slow them down. 5. He scrambled into the fireplace, his boots finding purchase on the rough stones. Soot rained down on him. The space was tight, claustrophobic. 3. He began to climb, his muscles screaming in protest. 1. The sound of a heavy log being used as a battering ram splintered the night. The door crashed inwards. As Silas and Thresher burst in, they must have tripped the table leg. The rifle fired with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the opposite wall. But the explosion of sound and smoke gave him the precious seconds he needed. He hauled himself up the last few feet of the chimney, gasping in the freezing night air as he emerged onto the roof. Below, shouts of anger and confusion erupted from the cabin. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled across the pitched roof and leaped into the darkness, landing hard in a deep snowdrift behind the cabin. He was free, but he was exposed. He had no weapon, no coat, and his only goal was to lead them away from the cabin, away from the girls hidden beneath the floor. He started to run, his boots sinking deep into the snow, his breath coming in ragged, burning clouds. He could hear them behind him, crashing through the underbrush, their curses echoing in the woods. He ran towards the ravine, towards the caves. He didn't know if he was running towards a trap or towards salvation. He just knew he had to keep going. He owed it to the 5 people who now made up his world. But as he reached the edge of the ravine, a figure stepped out from behind a massive pine tree, blocking his path. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't Thresher. It was Sheriff Brody. And he was pointing a shotgun directly at Emery's chest. "It's over, Voss," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Betrayal hit Emery like a physical blow. The sheriff, the law, and Clifftop was one of them. He was on Silas's payroll. The trap hadn't just been in the woods. The whole town was the trap. "You don't understand," Emery gasped, his lungs on fire. "He's a monster. He traffics children." "All I understand," Brody said, his eyes cold and hard, "is that you're a kidnapper and a squatter, and Lyle Thresher has the paperwork to prove it. Now get on the ground, slowly." From behind him, he could hear Silas and his men approaching, their footsteps closing in. He was caught. It was over. The girls would be found. Alma and Junie were probably already captured, or worse. The weight of his failure was absolute. But then something impossible happened. From deep within the ravine, from the mouth of the cave system, came a sound. A single, clear, piercing whistle. It wasn't Silas's whistle. It was a bird call. A signal Alma had taught the girls. A signal that meant we are safe and the plan is working. At the same moment, a bright orange flare shot up from further down the mountain, arcing high into the night sky. Sheriff Brody's head snapped towards the flare, his composure finally breaking. What in God's name is that? Emery didn't know, but a wild, desperate hope surged through him. Alma and Junie had made it. They had gotten through. Silas and Thresher burst through the trees, their faces furious. "What is going on?" Silas snarled, looking from the flare to the sheriff. "I told you to handle this quietly." And then from the direction of the main trail leading up the mountain came a new sound. Not the crunch of a few men, but the steady rhythmic beat of dozens of horses, their harnesses jangling, their riders carrying lanterns that cut through the darkness like a swarm of angry fireflies. Sheriff Brody lowered his shotgun, his face ashen. "Marshal," he breathed, "it's the U.S. Marshals." Alma and Junie hadn't just escaped. They hadn't just sent up a flare. They had walked right into the lion's den, found the one man in the territory Silas couldn't buy, and brought the full weight of federal law down on this forgotten mountain. The trap had been sprung, but not on Emery. Silas's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. Thresher looked like he was about to be sick. The game was up. The carefully constructed world of bribes and doctored papers was about to come crashing down. But Silas wasn't the kind of man to be taken alive. He pulled a pistol from his coat, his eyes wild. "It's not over," he screamed, and aimed not at the approaching marshals, but at Emery. He was going to take his revenge, even in defeat. Before he could fire, a shot rang out, but it wasn't from Silas's gun. Silas cried out, dropping his pistol as a red stain blossomed on his shoulder. Emery looked back toward the cabin. Standing on the porch, smoke curling from the barrel of the old hunting rifle, was May. Her face was tear-streaked and terrified, but her hands were steady. Beside her, Bess held the poker like a spear. They had come out of the cellar. They had seen him cornered, and they had saved him. The clearing was suddenly flooded with light as a dozen marshals on horseback swarmed in, rifles raised. "Federal officers, drop your weapons!" A man with a booming voice commanded. It was over in seconds. Thresher and the man in the vest surrendered immediately. Sheriff Brody dropped his shotgun and raised his hands, his career and his freedom evaporating before his eyes. Silas, clutching his wounded shoulder, was quickly subdued. As the marshals secured the prisoners, two figures emerged from the crowd. Alma and Junie. They ran to Emery, and for the first time, the four of them huddled together. A true family, not just of circumstance, but of battle. But Junie pulled back, her eyes searching Emery's face. There was one last piece of the puzzle, one final ghost that needed to be laid to rest. "Silas, he told us something in the cave," she said, her voice trembling. "He said you were there, the night of the fire, the night my parents—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Emery's heart broke. He had hoped, prayed, that this secret would stay buried forever. But there was no more running. He knelt down so he was at her eye level, and the whole world, the marshals, the prisoners, the mountain itself, seemed to fade away. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with a guilt that was more than a decade old. "I was there." The courtroom was just a single wide room in Denver, with two tall windows that looked out on a world that was finally starting to thaw. The potbelly stove in the back crackled, a warm and steady sound. Emery Voss stood before a federal judge. not in his worn wool coat, but in a borrowed suit that felt stiff and strange. He wasn't on trial. He was a witness. He told them everything. About Silas's cult-like group, the Community of Light. About how he and his young wife, Lenora, had been born into it. About the brand they all shared, a mark of ownership. He told them how Junie's parents had helped them escape, creating a diversion, a fire, that allowed them to slip away in the chaos. And he told them the part that had haunted him every day since. I went back, he said, his voice low, addressed not to the judge, but to Junie, who sat in the front row with Alma and the girls. I went back for them, but the fire, it was everywhere. Silas had made sure of it. I tried to get to them, but the roof came down. I failed. He finally looked at her, the shame he'd carried for years laid bare. My guilt, my grief. It's what drove Lenora away. It's why I hid on that mountain. And it's why, when I saw you three, I felt like it was a second chance. A chance to do right by the people I couldn't save. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I didn't buy you for $3 silver. I was trying to pay a debt that can never be paid. There was a long silence in the courtroom, broken only by the crackling stove. The judge, a man with tired eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, looked down at the mountain of evidence before him. Alma's ledger, the testimony of a dozen other victims the marshals had rounded up. Silas and his network were finished, but there was one last piece of business, the custody of the girls. The judge looked at them. Junie, May, Bess, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You've been through an ordeal I can't even imagine. The law says you should be placed in a state facility until a proper home can be found, but the law also has room for common sense. So I ask you, where do you want to go? Junie stood up, her small frame straight and tall. She didn't hesitate. She pointed a finger directly at Emery. We want to go home, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. With our papa. And that was it. No gavel slammed, no cheers erupted, just the quiet scratch of a pen on a piece of paper, signing away the ghosts of the past and granting custody of 3 brave little girls to a broken mountain man who had finally, after all these years, found his way home. Outside on the courthouse steps, the spring sun was warm on their faces. The world felt new, washed clean. As they stood there, blinking in the bright light, a carriage pulled up. A woman stepped out, shielded by one of the marshals. She was thin and pale, her eyes holding a haunted, distant look. But as she saw Emery, a flicker of recognition, of memory crossed her face. It was Lenora. Silas had kept her all these years, another one of his collected souls. Her reunion with Emery was quiet, awkward, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken words. They were strangers now, 2 people whose shared path had diverged so long ago, it was impossible to find their way back. She would go with Alma, who, it turned out, was her long-lost younger sister, and together they would start the slow, painful process of healing. As Lenora was about to leave, she turned to Emery. You have children, she said, a sad, wondering smile on her face. You finally got your family, Emery. He looked at Junie, May, and Bess, who were now clinging to his hands, his legs, his very being. Yeah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I guess I did. Spring came slow to the mountain that year, as if it, too, needed time to believe again. But it came. The creek behind the cabin began to hum its old song. Green shoots pushed their way through the last of the frost. And in the soft patch of earth by the back fence, the sunflower seeds Junie had planted finally broke through the surface, reaching for the sun. Emery Voss, once a man of profound silence and bare rooms, now spent his days stepping over skipping ropes and drying dresses just to get to his own porch. He still rose before the sun, still fed the chickens first, still split wood with the rhythmic grace of long practice. But now there was laughter under his roof, real, honest-to-God laughter. And somewhere in the middle of all the daily chores, his house had finally become a home. One evening, Junie brought him a drawing she'd made. It was 5 stick figures holding hands under a big lopsided tree. Above them, in a child's careful scrawl, was a single word, family. He didn't say anything. He just kissed the top of her head, and tacked the drawing to the wall, right where the morning sun would hit it first. The old rose bushes he'd planted for the children he thought he'd never have. He didn't tear them out. Instead, he and the girls tended to them, clearing the weeds, turning the soil. And one day, against all odds, a single perfect red bud appeared on one of the thorny stems. It turns out that sometimes the best things in life don't arrive on time. They don't follow a plan. They show up late, unexpected after you've nearly given up waiting. They show up broken and battered and scared. And you take them in, and you heal together. And that's what makes them holy. This story is a powerful reminder that family isn't about blood. It's made by moments, by hands reaching for each other in the dark, and choosing, again and again, not to let go. Emery didn't set out to be a hero, but by opening his heart, he showed 3 little girls they were worth fighting for. What did you think of Emery's journey? Let me know in the comments below what part of the story hit you the hardest. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thanks for listening.